Christmas Eve, 1843. Kingston, Jamaica. In the dining room of Hanover Estate, 12 overseers are raising their glasses in celebration, completely unaware that their festive pudding has been laced with enough poison to kill them all. By dawn, half of them will be dead. By New Year's Day, 6 enslaved women will be facing execution for the most sophisticated mass poisoning in Caribbean history. But here's what the history books won't tell you. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a military operation, planned with surgical precision by women who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. What you're about to hear is the true story of how Mary Campbell and 5 other enslaved women turned a Christmas dinner into a declaration of war against their oppressors. The details of this plot were buried for over a century, suppressed by colonial authorities who feared that other enslaved people might be inspired to follow their example. But recently discovered court records and witness testimonies reveal the shocking truth about the night that shook the British Empire to its core. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because in the next 30 minutes, you'll discover how 6 women with no formal education orchestrated the deadliest slave revolt in Jamaican history, and why their story was hidden from the world for so long. But first, let me tell you about the woman whose brilliant mind conceived this audacious plan, and the hell that drove her to risk everything for one night of justice. Mary Campbell wasn't born a revolutionary. She was born a slave on Christmas Day, 1815, on the very estate where she would later orchestrate the most famous mass poisoning in Caribbean history. The irony of her birth date wasn't lost on her. She would often tell the other enslaved women that Christmas was the day God gave her to the world as a gift, and Christmas would be the day she gave the world a gift in return. By 1843, Jamaica had been living under a lie for 9 years. The Emancipation Act of 1834 had officially freed all enslaved people in the British Empire, but in reality, the system that replaced slavery was barely different from what came before. The apprenticeship system forced former slaves to work for their former masters without wages for up to 6 more years. Even after apprenticeship officially ended in 1838, most formerly enslaved people found themselves trapped in contracts and debt systems that kept them bound to the plantations where they had been enslaved. Kingston itself was a city built entirely on the backs of enslaved labor. With nearly 18,000 enslaved people living in the city by the 1840s, it had the largest concentration of enslaved people in the British Caribbean. The wealth that flowed through Kingston's merchant houses, the grand buildings that lined its streets, the ships that filled its harbor, all of it existed because of the unpaid labor of people like Mary Campbell and her 5 co-conspirators. Mary had risen to the position of head cook at Hanover Estate through a combination of intelligence, skill, and careful political maneuvering. She could read and write, skills she had learned in secret from a sympathetic Baptist missionary who had visited the estate when she was a teenager. This literacy gave her access to information that other enslaved women lacked, and it also made her valuable to the estate's overseers, who sometimes used her to keep records of food supplies and workers' rations. But Mary's most dangerous skill wasn't her ability to read or cook. It was her memory. She could recall every conversation she had ever overheard, every routine the overseers followed, every weakness in the estate's security. She had spent 28 years studying her oppressors, learning their habits, mapping their vulnerabilities. By 1843, she knew more about the daily operations of Hanover Estate than some of the overseers themselves. The other 5 women who would join Mary's conspiracy each brought their own skills and motivations to the plot. Keziah Williams, 25, had worked as Mary's assistant in the kitchen for 3 years. She had been repeatedly sexually assaulted by Overseer Bennett, who had fathered 2 of her children before selling them to other plantations when they reached working age. The pain of losing her children had driven Keziah to the edge of madness, and she often spoke of wanting to make them pay for what they had done to her family. Esther Morgan, 31, served meals and maintained the dining room where the overseers ate. She bore permanent scars on her back from a Christmas Eve whipping she had received the previous year for accidentally breaking a wine glass during the overseers' holiday celebration. The cruel irony that she had been beaten on the same night that Mary was planning to strike exactly 1 year later was not lost on any of the conspirators. Sarah Thompson managed the estate's laundry and had access to the overseer's personal quarters, where she could observe their daily routines and eavesdrop on their private conversations. Ruth Davis cleaned these same quarters and worked closely with Sarah to gather intelligence about the overseer's plans and vulnerabilities. Grace Hamilton worked in the estate's herb garden and possessed extensive knowledge of the medicinal and poisonous properties of local plants, knowledge that would prove crucial to the success of their plan. What made these 6 women so dangerous wasn't just their individual skills, it was their collective intelligence and their absolute commitment to their cause. Unlike previous slave revolts, which had often been spontaneous uprisings driven by immediate anger or desperation, Mary's conspiracy was carefully planned over months, with each woman playing a specific role designed to maximize their chances of success while minimizing the risk of discovery. The women had developed their own system of coded communication, using seemingly innocent conversations about food preparation and household tasks to share information and coordinate their activities. They met regularly in the herb garden after their daily work was finished, ostensibly to collect medicinal plants for treating minor illnesses among the estate's workers, but actually to plan every detail of their attack. But what truly set Mary Campbell apart from other resistance leaders was her understanding that their revolt needed to send a message that would resonate far beyond the boundaries of Hanover Estate. She wasn't just planning to kill 12 overseers. She was planning to prove that enslaved people possessed the intelligence, organization, and determination to strike back against their oppressors in ways that the colonial authorities could never prevent or predict. The Christmas dinner wasn't just a murder plot. It was a psychological warfare campaign designed to shatter the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire system of Caribbean slavery was built. The planning began in earnest on September 15, 1843, the day after Grace Hamilton suffered the beating that would transform 6 individual grievances into a collective conspiracy for revenge. Grace had been working in the herb garden when Overseer Mitchell approached her and demanded sexual favors. When she refused, he beat her so severely with a riding crop that she was unable to stand for 3 days. As Grace lay recovering in the women's quarters, the other 5 women took turns caring for her wounds and listening to her fevered promises of revenge. It was during one of these bedside vigils that Mary first spoke the words that would doom 12 men. "What if we didn't have to endure this anymore? What if we made them pay the ultimate price for what they've done to us?" The conversation that followed was careful and coded, as the women were acutely aware that other enslaved workers might overhear and report their words to the overseers in exchange for better treatment. But by the end of Grace's recovery period, the 6 women had committed to a course of action that would either free them or kill them. Grace's botanical knowledge became the foundation of their plan. Working in the estate's herb garden had given her access to dozens of plants, and her grandmother's teachings had provided her with detailed knowledge of their properties. She knew which plants could cause temporary illness, which could cause permanent disability, and which could cause death. More importantly, she knew how to prepare these plants in ways that would mask their taste and smell when mixed with food. The weapon they chose was the rosary pea, known locally as crab's eye for its distinctive red and black coloring. These seeds contain abrin, a toxin that is actually more deadly than ricin and causes a horrific death over the course of 3 to 7 days. The victims experience severe abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, organ failure, and eventually cardiac arrest. Perhaps most importantly for the conspirators' purposes, the initial symptoms of rosary pea poisoning closely resemble food poisoning or excessive alcohol consumption, meaning that the true cause might not be discovered until it was too late to save the victims. But obtaining enough rosary pea seeds to poison 12 men presented significant challenges. The seeds were commonly used in jewelry and decorations, but purchasing large quantities would certainly arouse suspicion. The solution came from Sarah Thompson, whose laundry duties took her into Kingston's market district several times each week. She began making small purchases of rosary pea jewelry from different vendors, claiming that she was making decorations for the upcoming Christmas celebrations. Over the course of 2 months, she accumulated nearly 200 seeds, more than enough to kill their intended targets. The processing of the seeds required even more careful planning. Rosary pea seeds are extremely hard and must be crushed or ground before they will release their toxic compounds. Grace and Keziah spent their evening meetings in the herb garden grinding small quantities of seeds using a mortar and pestle, working by moonlight to avoid detection. The grinding process was slow and dangerous. Even inhaling the dust from crushed rosary pea seeds can cause serious illness, but the women persevered, motivated by years of accumulated rage and the promise of finally striking back at their oppressors. The ground seeds produced a fine, dark powder that looked remarkably similar to black pepper. This similarity wasn't accidental. Mary had specifically requested that Grace create a poison that could be easily concealed in the heavily spiced dishes that were traditional at Christmas celebrations. The final product was stored in empty spice containers that Mary kept in the kitchen spice cabinet, hidden among dozens of legitimate seasonings. Testing the poison presented another challenge. The women couldn't risk poisoning other enslaved people or domestic animals that might be missed and investigated. The solution came when a chicken on the estate became sick with what appeared to be a respiratory infection. Grace volunteered to treat the bird with herbs, but actually fed it a small quantity of their ground rosary pea seeds. The chicken died 3 days later, confirming both the potency of their preparation and the timeline they could expect for their human victims. As the weeks passed, the women refined every aspect of their plan. Mary memorized the seating arrangement for the Christmas dinner and calculated exactly how much poison each overseer would need to consume to ensure death. Esther practiced serving techniques that would allow her to ensure that the poisoned dishes reached their intended targets. Sarah and Ruth mapped the overseers' evening routines to identify the best times for the conspirators to meet without being detected. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their planning was the development of their cover story. If their plot was discovered before it could be executed, the women would claim that they had been attempting to prepare traditional herbal remedies and had accidentally used the wrong plants. To support this story, Grace began openly collecting and drying various medicinal herbs, creating a legitimate cover for her botanical activities and the presence of plant materials in her quarters. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical planning. Each woman had to overcome not just the natural reluctance to commit murder, but also the deeply ingrained conditioning that taught enslaved people to accept their suffering without resistance. The breakthrough came when Mary began telling the others about her dreams, vivid nightmares in which she saw the faces of enslaved children who had been sold away from their families, the scars of women who had been beaten for minor infractions, the graves of workers who had died from overwork and neglect. These dreams, she told them, were messages from the ancestors, calling upon them to strike back against the system that had caused so much suffering. By December 1843, the 6 women had transformed from individual victims into a coordinated resistance cell. They had weapons, they had a plan, they had alibis, and most importantly, they had the absolute conviction that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for every enslaved person who had ever suffered under the brutal system of Caribbean plantation slavery. All that remained was to wait for Christmas Eve and the opportunity to serve their oppressors one final, fatal meal. December 24, 1843, dawned with an ominous red sky that Grace Hamilton took as a sign from the ancestors that their night of reckoning had arrived. The irony wasn't lost on any of the conspirators that they would be serving what they hoped would be the Last Supper to their oppressors on the same day that Christians celebrated the birth of their Savior. Mary arrived in the kitchen before dawn, as was her custom. But this morning was different. Hidden beneath her usual calm efficiency was the knowledge that she was about to execute the most audacious act of resistance in Caribbean history. She began her preparations by examining the rosary pea powder one final time. The fruit of 2 months of grinding and planning, now stored in an innocent-looking pepper container that would deliver death to 12 men. The Christmas menu had been planned weeks in advance to showcase the estate's prosperity and the culinary skills of its enslaved workers. The centerpiece would be a massive roasted pig, flanked by traditional English puddings adapted for the tropical climate. Mary had specifically recommended the plum pudding and rum punch for the celebration, knowing that these heavily spiced dishes would perfectly mask the bitter taste of the rosary pea powder. But what the overseers didn't know was that Mary had been conducting her own twisted form of quality control testing. Over the previous week, she had been adding tiny amounts of various spices to the overseers' regular meals, carefully noting which combinations they seemed to prefer and which they complained about. This intelligence allowed her to calculate exactly how much poison she could add to each dish without arousing suspicion through taste or smell. The first critical moment came at mid-morning when other enslaved workers began arriving to help with the food preparation. Mary had to add the poison to the plum pudding while surrounded by potential witnesses, any of whom might report suspicious behavior in exchange for favored treatment from the overseers. She waited until the kitchen was at its busiest, with workers focused on their own tasks, before casually reaching for what appeared to be her black pepper container and adding generous portions to the pudding mixture. The amount of poison she added was calculated with deadly precision. Based on Grace's research and their test on the sick chicken, Mary knew that approximately 1/8 of a teaspoon of ground rosary pea seeds would be sufficient to kill a full-grown man within a week. She added nearly a full teaspoon to the plum pudding, ensuring that each of the 6 primary targets would receive a lethal dose even if they only consumed small portions. Keziah's role became crucial during the preparation of the rum punch. The traditional recipe called for a complex mixture of rum, sugar, lime juice, nutmeg, and other spices that would effectively conceal the addition of poison. More importantly, rum punch was served from a common bowl throughout the evening, meaning that all 12 overseers would consume at least some of the poisoned beverage regardless of their individual food preferences. The psychological pressure on the conspirators was intense. They were surrounded by other enslaved workers who had no knowledge of the plot, and they had to maintain their usual demeanor while preparing to commit mass murder. Any sign of nervousness or unusual behavior could expose their plan and result in immediate execution. Mary later said that she felt as if every other person in the kitchen could hear her heart beating, and that she was certain someone would notice the slight tremor in her hands as she seasoned the dishes that would kill their oppressors. As the afternoon progressed, the women began to feel the weight of their decision. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about sending a message that would reverberate throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Every enslaved person would hear about what happened at Hanover Estate on Christmas Eve, 1843, and they would know that resistance was possible, that their oppressors were not invincible, that justice could be served even by those who had been denied every legal and social protection. The final preparations took place in an atmosphere of forced normalcy. The great house dining room was decorated with tropical flowers and palm fronds, creating a festive atmosphere that would serve as the backdrop for mass murder. Crystal glasses were polished to a brilliant shine, silver serving dishes were arranged with military precision, and the long mahogany table was set for 12 men who had no idea they were attending their own funeral. Esther's role became critical during the final hours before the dinner. As the person responsible for serving, she had to ensure that the poisoned dishes reached their intended targets while the unpoisoned or lightly poisoned items went to the overseers they had decided to spare. She had memorized not just the seating arrangement, but also the individual preferences and eating habits of each overseer, knowledge that would determine who lived and who died. At 6 o'clock, the overseers began arriving at the great house, dressed in their finest clothes and carrying bottles of their most expensive rum and wine to share with their colleagues. They were in exceptionally high spirits, having received word that sugar prices in London had reached a 5-year high, meaning substantial profits for the estate and generous bonuses for themselves. The atmosphere in the dining room was jovial and relaxed as the 12 men took their seats around the candlelit table. They had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. The food smelled delicious, the rum punch was expertly prepared, and their enslaved servants appeared to be as docile and subservient as always. What they couldn't see was the intense focus in Mary's eyes as she supervised each dish that left the kitchen, or the slight smile that crossed Esther's lips as she served the first portions of poisoned plum pudding. The dinner began with toasts to the estate's prosperity and crude jokes about their plans for the enslaved women in the coming year. The overseers complimented Mary on the quality of the food, particularly the plum pudding, which several described as the best they had ever tasted. Overseer Bennett, who had repeatedly sexually assaulted Keziah, called for seconds and thirds, consuming far more poison than Mary had originally planned and sealing his fate beyond any possibility of survival. As the evening progressed and the rum punch flowed freely, the overseers became increasingly intoxicated and boisterous. What they didn't realize was that the alcohol was actually accelerating the absorption of the rosary pea toxin into their bloodstreams, ensuring that the poison would take effect more quickly and with greater intensity than Grace's calculations had predicted. The first sign that something was wrong came at approximately 10:30, when Overseer Roberts suddenly doubled over with severe abdominal cramps. The other overseers initially laughed at his discomfort, assuming he had simply overeaten or consumed too much alcohol. But when 3 more overseers began experiencing similar symptoms within the next hour, the jovial atmosphere of the celebration rapidly transformed into panic and confusion. By midnight on Christmas Eve, 6 overseers were violently ill with symptoms that no amount of medical knowledge could explain. The Christmas celebration had become a medical emergency, and the enslaved women who had planned and executed the poisoning stood along the walls of the dining room, maintaining their poses of concerned servitude while secretly celebrating the success of their deadly plot. Christmas morning, 1843, brought scenes that would haunt Hanover Estate forever. 3 overseers, Roberts, Crawford, and Mitchell, lay dead in their beds, their bodies grotesquely contorted by the final spasms of rosary pea poisoning. 3 more, Bennett, Thompson, and Williams, were clearly dying, their skin taking on the grayish pallor that indicated total organ failure. The remaining 6 overseers were desperately ill but still clinging to life, creating a medical crisis unlike anything colonial Jamaica had ever witnessed. Dr. Morrison arrived from Kingston at dawn to find a scene that defied his medical training and experience. In his 20 years of practice in the Caribbean, he had treated victims of yellow fever, malaria, cholera, and dozens of other tropical diseases, but he had never seen symptoms like these. The victims displayed signs of severe systemic poisoning, bloody diarrhea, violent vomiting, delirium, and cardiovascular collapse, but there was no obvious source of contamination. The breakthrough came when Dr. Morrison began questioning the surviving overseers about everything they had consumed during the Christmas Eve dinner. The pattern quickly became apparent. Those who had eaten the largest portions of plum pudding and consumed the most rum punch were either dead or dying, while those who had consumed smaller quantities were less severely affected. This could only mean one thing: the food had been deliberately poisoned. Word of the mass poisoning spread through Kingston's white community like wildfire, creating a panic that reached far beyond the boundaries of Hanover Estate. If enslaved people could successfully poison 12 overseers in their own dining room, what was to prevent similar attacks on every plantation in the colony? The psychological impact of the poisoning was as devastating as its physical effects. It shattered the fundamental assumption that enslaved people were docile and controllable, and it introduced an element of fear into the relationship between masters and slaves that would never entirely disappear. Thomas Wickham, the estate owner, arrived from Kingston by noon accompanied by colonial magistrate James Harrison and a full company of soldiers from the West India Regiment. Their first action was to place the entire estate under martial law, confining all enslaved workers to their quarters except when being interrogated about their possible involvement in the poisoning plot. The investigation that followed was systematic and brutal. Every enslaved person who had been involved in food preparation or service was arrested and subjected to intensive questioning. The soldiers searched every building on the estate, looking for evidence of poison, weapons, or conspiracy. They found what they were looking for in the kitchen spice cabinet: an empty container that still bore traces of ground rosary pea seeds, and several whole seeds that had been overlooked during the grinding process. Mary Campbell, as head cook, was the first to be arrested and brought before the military tribunal that had been hastily established in the Great House parlor. The interrogation was conducted by Magistrate Harrison, Dr. Morrison, and Colonel Williams of the West India Regiment, with Thomas Wickham observing from a corner of the room. Mary was chained to a chair and surrounded by armed soldiers, but she maintained her composure and initially denied any knowledge of how poison could have entered the Christmas dinner. The interrogators had come prepared with more than just questions. They had brought instruments of torture that were routinely used to extract confessions from enslaved people accused of serious crimes. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Mary could cooperate and provide the information they wanted, or she could be tortured until she gave them what they needed to know. The choice was hers, but the outcome was predetermined. The psychological pressure intensified when the interrogators brought Mary's 8-year-old daughter into the room and threatened to sell the child to a sugar plantation in Barbados if Mary continued to claim innocence. This was the moment when Mary's composure finally cracked. She could accept torture and death for herself, but she could not condemn her daughter to a lifetime of slavery in the hell of a sugar plantation. With tears streaming down her face, she confessed to her role in the poisoning but initially claimed to have acted alone. However, the investigators were not convinced that a single person could have carried out such a sophisticated plan. The timing had been too precise, the targeting too selective, the execution too flawless for this to have been the work of one woman acting in isolation. They continued to pressure Mary for the names of her co-conspirators, alternating between threats against her daughter and promises that cooperation might result in a more merciful sentence. The interrogation continued for 6 hours before Mary finally broke completely. She provided detailed information about how the plot had been conceived and planned, identifying each of her 5 co-conspirators and describing their specific roles in the conspiracy. She also revealed the location of the remaining rosary pea seeds and explained how the poison had been prepared and administered to its victims. The arrests of the other 5 women followed quickly. Grace Hamilton was found in the herb garden, attempting to destroy evidence of her botanical activities. Keziah Williams was dragged from the kitchen where she had been trying to maintain the pretense of normal food preparation. Esther Morgan, Sarah Thompson, and Ruth Davis were taken from their workstations throughout the Great House, each one initially claiming innocence before being confronted with Mary's detailed confession. The 6 women were imprisoned in the estate's stone storehouse, chained to the walls and given minimal food and water while they awaited trial. Colonial law required that enslaved people accused of murdering their masters be tried within 30 days to prevent the spread of unrest among other enslaved populations. The trial was scheduled to begin on January 15, 1844, in Kingston's Colonial Courthouse, where justice would be swift, certain, and brutal. But even as the women sat in chains awaiting their inevitable executions, word of their rebellion was spreading throughout the Caribbean. Enslaved people on other plantations were hearing whispered accounts of the Christmas Eve poisoning, and rather than being deterred by the brutal consequences, many were inspired by the courage and intelligence that Mary Campbell and her co-conspirators had displayed. The authorities had captured and condemned the conspirators, but they could not contain the revolutionary ideas that the women had unleashed. The psychological impact of the Hanover estate poisoning would reverberate throughout the British Caribbean for years to come, fundamentally altering the relationship between enslaved people and their oppressors and contributing to the growing momentum for complete abolition of the slavery system that had survived even emancipation. January 15, 1844, marked the beginning of what would become known as the Trial of the 6 Martyrs, a legal proceeding that was predetermined in its outcome but profound in its historical significance. The Colonial Courthouse in Kingston was packed with spectators, both black and white, who had come to witness what many considered to be the most important trial in Caribbean history. The 6 women entered the courthouse in chains, but they carried themselves with a dignity that surprised and unsettled many of the white observers. Mary Campbell, as the acknowledged leader of the conspiracy, walked at the front of the group with her head held high and her eyes fixed straight ahead. Behind her, Keziah Williams, Esther Morgan, Sarah Thompson, Ruth Davis, and Grace Hamilton maintained similar composures, showing no signs of the fear or remorse that colonial authorities had expected to see. The trial itself was a formality, as colonial law provided virtually no protections for enslaved people accused of crimes against whites. The women were not allowed legal representation, could not testify in their own defense, and could not call witnesses to speak on their behalf. The only evidence presented was Mary's forced confession, Dr. Morrison's medical testimony about the cause of death, and the physical evidence of rosary pea seeds found in the kitchen. However, what should have been a routine condemnation became something entirely different when Magistrate Harrison made the unusual decision to allow each woman to make a final statement before sentencing. This decision, which was not required by law, may have been motivated by curiosity about the women's motivations or by a desire to extract additional information about possible co-conspirators on other estates. Mary Campbell's statement lasted nearly 10 minutes and was later described by witnesses as one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered in a colonial courtroom. She spoke without notes or preparation, but with an eloquence that demonstrated the intelligence and education that she had hidden from her oppressors for decades. She began by acknowledging her role in the poisoning, but she refused to express remorse for her actions. "We were not born to be slaves," Mary told the packed courtroom, her voice carrying to every corner of the building. "We were born as human beings, with souls and minds and hearts that cry out for freedom and dignity. For 28 years, I served men who treated me as property, who beat me when I displeased them, who sold my children when it suited their convenience, who used my body for their pleasure without my consent. I cooked their food, I cleaned their houses, I raised their children, and in return, I was given nothing but suffering and degradation. She continued by describing the specific abuses that had driven her and her co-conspirators to their desperate act of resistance. She spoke about the sexual assaults, the brutal beatings, the separation of families, the denial of basic human dignity that characterized daily life for enslaved people on Caribbean plantations. Her words painted a picture of systematic cruelty that made even some of the white spectators uncomfortable, as they were forced to confront the reality of the system that supported their prosperity. "We chose to act because we could no longer live as animals," Mary concluded. "We chose to die as human beings rather than continue to exist as property. If that makes us criminals in your eyes, then we accept that judgment. But history will remember us not as criminals, but as women who had the courage to strike back against an evil system that should never have been allowed to exist." The statements by the other 5 women were shorter but equally powerful. Keziah Williams spoke about the children who had been sold away from her and the sexual violence she had endured. Grace Hamilton described the beating that had finally driven her to join the conspiracy. Each woman used her final public platform to bear witness to the horrors of slavery and to justify their actions as a necessary response to intolerable oppression. The trial concluded with the inevitable guilty verdicts and death sentences. All 6 women were condemned to death, with Mary Campbell sentenced to be burned alive as the ringleader, and the other 5 sentenced to hanging. However, Magistrate Harrison announced that the executions would be public and mandatory for all enslaved and formerly enslaved people in the Kingston area, turning the women's deaths into a spectacle designed to deter future resistance. The sentences created controversy throughout the Caribbean and reached anti-slavery activists in Britain who were still fighting to improve conditions for formerly enslaved people in the colonies. Petitions were organized calling for clemency, and several prominent religious leaders spoke out against the brutality of burning a human being alive. However, colonial authorities were determined to make an example that would prevent similar uprisings on other plantations. The executions took place on February 1, 1844, in Kingston's public square before a crowd estimated at over 3,000 people. The colonial government had intended the spectacle to serve as a deterrent, but the actual impact was far more complex. The executions took place on February 1, 1844, in Kingston's public square before a crowd estimated at over 3,000 people. The colonial government had intended the spectacle to serve as a deterrent, but the actual impact was far more complex and transformative than they had anticipated. Mary Campbell was the first to die. She walked to the stake with her head held high, refusing the blindfold that was offered to her. As the flames were lit, she spoke her final words to the crowd. "Tell our story. Tell them we were not criminals. We were freedom fighters." She died without crying out, maintaining her dignity even as the fire consumed her. The hanging of Keziah, Esther, Sarah, Ruth, and Grace followed immediately after. Each woman used her final moments to speak truth to power, describing the abuses they had endured and the reasons for their rebellion. Their words were recorded by Baptist missionary James Philippo, who later published them in anti-slavery newspapers throughout Britain and the United States. But the colonial authorities had miscalculated the impact of their brutal spectacle. Instead of crushing the spirit of resistance, the executions created powerful martyrs whose story spread throughout the Caribbean faster than any official suppression could contain. Enslaved people on plantations across Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and beyond heard detailed accounts of the Christmas Eve poisoning and the courage of the 6 women who had died for their freedom. The poisoning fundamentally changed the psychology of Caribbean slavery. For the first time, enslaved people had proven they could strike back with intelligence, planning, and devastating effectiveness. Plantation owners throughout the region implemented new security measures, hired white cooks to replace enslaved workers in sensitive positions, and lived with a new awareness that their oppression could no longer be maintained without constant fear of retaliation. More importantly, The story of Mary Campbell and her 5 co-conspirators became part of the underground oral tradition among Jamaica's black population. February 1st became an unofficial day of remembrance, and their names were preserved in songs and stories that would inspire future generations of freedom fighters. Their legacy lived on in the growing movement that would eventually bring full freedom to the Caribbean. The Christmas Eve poisoning of 1843 stands as one of the most sophisticated acts of slave resistance in Caribbean history. 6 women with no formal education, no resources, and no legal protections had successfully challenged the entire structure of colonial power and proven that the human desire for freedom could never be completely extinguished. Today, as we remember Mary Campbell, Keziah Williams, Esther Morgan, Sarah Thompson, Ruth Davis, and Grace Hamilton, we honor not just their courage, but their intelligence, their planning, and their absolute commitment to justice. They transformed themselves from victims into warriors, and their legacy continues to inspire struggles for human rights around the world. Their story reminds us that resistance takes many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful acts of rebellion come not from armies or governments, but from ordinary people who refuse to accept that oppression is inevitable. They proved that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to fight back and demand dignity. If this story of courage and resistance moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from Caribbean history. Share your thoughts in the comments about how these 6 women's legacy continues to inspire us today. And remember, the struggle for justice never ends, it just passes from one generation to the next.